BC, nice to see you again. Thanks for coming back. This feels like the 100th hour, probably for you. For me, it's all riveting. We talked. So this is our third interview. So we talked previously around the sort of technicalities of the SR-71, and you were going through the process of describing a typical mission profile. So what we're going to do today is we'll sort of talk about the operational life of an SR-71 pilot or systems operator, and look at how the missions were generated, how they came down to you, what the traditions of the community were, how Habu came about, for example. But I thought I will keep quiet, I promise, and just allow you to complete your narrative then around a mission profile, because I think we got to the point where you were talking about sort of following the black line, which was the sort of map on the map in front of you that told you where to go, while the guy in the back sort of ran the systems. So can you pick it up from there, take it from there?
Yes. Well, first of all, the training for the missions was very intensive, comprehensive, complicated, but the end result, I think, for all of the crews was about the same. The pilot and the RSO were very close. If love is too strong a word, I don't think so. It's that we really had a great bond between us when we had an RSO, because we went through a lot of grief and a lot of training. The training in SR-71 was intensive, and it was non-yielding. You had to know your stuff, and then we practiced, and we gave each other simulators, which is kind of unusual. Usually you go to a simulator bank and some instructor gives it to you. Once you were checked out as a operational pilot, then you were automatically a simulator instructor. And so the people who instructed me when I was a fledgling SR pilot trying to upgrade, I would be their instructor. And we had a 2-page critique that we would fill out after each one. Anyway, that was part of the preparation. The mission planning for an operational mission, or for a training mission for that matter, was done the day before. You go up to Intel, to the vault, and see what we were going to fly, and then get the map, the mission materials, the NOTAMs, the notice to airmen messages for any of the airfields that might be our alternates. And then we would get a political briefing on is there anything unusual about our flight? What should we look for? Sometimes they would tell us bases that we could not land. And it was the first time I heard that, I thought it was a country, and I don't want to name the country, but it was a country that we would crash the airplane before we would land in that country. And that country, seemingly, to my inexperienced ears, seemed like a friendly country. But for some reason, there was a political reason not to do that, and that list would change. So the mission planning took 2 or 3 hours. The RSO and the pilot would go over and always talk about the alternates. What if? And Jay Reed particularly was very methodical, and he always told me in flight what the next alternate was. Anyway, so that's the mission planning. The day of the flight, we would report to the physical support division, have our meal of steak and eggs, which was by regulation. Not that we had to have it, but it had to be offered to us. So we would have that. They had a dedicated cook that just cooked for us. I'm sure he had other duties, but he was the same guy every time. So he knew what we wanted. So the steaks were always ready for us. And then the crew chief would come in while we were having a dinner, and he would drink coffee with us and talk about the airplane. The SR-71, unlike any of the other Air Force airplanes I've flown, would not fly with a delayed discrepancy. If there was a discrepancy on the airplane, it was fixed before the next flight. So the logistics train coming into the SR was quite long, and it was quite effective. We always had spare parts. Anyway, we talk about the airplane, and then we suit up and go out to the airplane, do a pre-flight. We wouldn't pre-brief like the U-2s because our uh, pre-flight checklist was so long. It took about 45 minutes to get off the ground anyway. So we pre-briefed at 45 minutes, and then we had the 20 minutes or so it took to get to the tanker. And so all of that added up to about an hour of pre-breathing 100% oxygen to try to flush out the nitrogen in the blood so that we'd be less susceptible to the bends. So that's the mission plan. We already talked about going out to the tanker. Now, after we get off the tanker and we do the acceleration up to, I never flew. I think maybe 3 or 4 flights in my career that I did not go supersonic because the airplane was built for that. There's really no reason to fly the airplane unless you're going to exercise the supersonic capabilities of the airplane, the heat and all that. And that just kept the airplane ready. It kept the maintenance knew, what to expect. So when we after we did the accel and we leveled off and we're following the black line, and I told you it's very important to do that stateside so we don't boom towns or cities. We kept the line pretty much. We usually go north and south in the western United States where there's not a lot of people, or out over the ocean. Then during the for all flights, I would disconnect the autopilot and hand fly it for a while, and then go through a manual inlet series where I would put the restart switch on, make the inlet safe with the forward bypass doors and the spike full forward, and then reconfigure the the inlet manually, fly with that for a while, and then go back to auto, make sure it all worked. Did that on every training mission for sure. The operational mission, I may not do that because I didn't want to mess it up. So our flights would generally get us back. If we had, we numbered or called the flights by loops, how many times we refueled actually. So if you go hit the tanker, make a hot leg, a Mach 3 run, and then recover back at your base, then that's called a one loop. If you instead of recovering the base, you go to another tanker, then that would be a two loop mission, and that's the vernacular that we use. To rendezvous for the tanker, about 200 miles or so from the tanker, we'd start ranging. Actually, we start ranging maybe before that. Start the descent around there, and so we were heading for the tanker, and he's in an orbit, pre-planned orbit at a pre-planned altitude. And then we had a secure UHF radio that we could talk to the tanker on. We had ranging, so we knew bearing and distance from the tanker. And we just followed that on in. And there was an elaborate procedure for descent, which we would undo the switches that we did on the way up. And we could not, for instance, when you come down, you can't bring the throttles back to idle, because if you did that, you would the engines would be cooled too quickly. So the first action is to come out of afterburner. We cruised in afterburner the whole time we were in cruise. The first thing is to bring both throttles to the mill power position, 100% power without afterburner. And then you watch the Mach, and the Mach would come down, 2.9, 2.8, 2.7, very slow descent. And then once it got down to about Mach 2.5 or so, then the drag would start increasing. So then we'd lower the nose. Then we had some other bypass doors to operate, and inlet guide vanes and so forth. So about 35,000 feet or so is when we would go subsonic. By that time, since the drag is increasing this whole time, our nose low attitude is 15 degrees, so you're kind of looking at the ground. We called that the re-entry maneuver because we're coming in very flat, about 12 degrees nose high at cruise. And then by the time we get down to 35,000, we are 15 degrees low. And then we break through the sound barrier, go down now we're at Mach 0.9 something. And then we would have to bring the nose back up to about 10 degrees nose low, or no, 5 degrees or so. It was a considerable change in drag. And then we were kind of like a normal airplane. So we would hit the tanker. I would usually maintain a 100-knot overtake on the tanker until I saw him. And then, because the airplane had no problem slowing down, not too much of a problem. So I always see the tanker out to the left, because they always did the same rendezvous. And they'd be in a 30-degree bank turn, so the big platform, it'd be easy to spot the tanker. He would roll out almost always right on our course. And we would have to just follow and meet the tanker. I told you about the one time that I had to go in within a mile without seeing the tanker, but that, again, that's okay because we confirmed our altitude. So after we that's it for the mission and the coming down. But now the next thing you wanted to hear was what? Coming back to the pattern, we would generally have about 20,000 pounds of fuel. My personal bingo was when I saw less than 10,000 pounds of fuel, then my next landing or my next circuit was a full stop. So about 20,000 pounds, we could do a penetration approach. We could do a GCA, a ground controlled approach, or a instrument landing system approach, maybe one or two of those. Maybe hit the circuit. We were all of us could do touch and goes because it was a single pilot airplane. So we might do a touch and go. My technique was not to do a touch and go because I didn't want to hurt the tires. Those tires were only good for about 12 landings. So I would do a very low approach and with the gear down, try to go as low to the runway as I could without touching, which is a nice skill to have because you want to know where the runway is, and the ability to hold the airplane very steady and very level. So that's what I would do. And then when I saw 10,000 pounds of fuel, then my next one was a full stop. Our approach speed was 175 knots plus 1 knot for every 100 pounds above 10,000 pounds, or for every 1,000 pounds above 10,000 pounds. So normally my approach speed was 175 knots. Like a normal airplane, 3-degree glide slope or so, coming down to the runway, we would always aim for I would aim for the center of the overrun at a quarter of a mile, because this is a big delta wing airplane. It has lots of ground effect. So this was unlike any jet that I've flown. At a quarter of a mile, I'd go to idle. And then just, as my B-57 instructor said, paint the airplane onto the runway, and it would generally land certainly the first 1,000 feet in that technique. Given fuel, given wind, of course, you have a 30-knot headwind, you might make it a little closer than a quarter mile. But that's how you land the airplane. I never liked to hear SR pilots say, "Oh, it was an easy airplane to land." Well, if everything works out, it's an easy airplane to land. Its maximum crosswind was 15 to 20 knots. So I've landed in crosswind because sometimes in Okinawa you don't have any choice unless you go to Naha, but I wouldn't do that. I landed in about a 25-knot crosswind, and I could see the reason why they had that limit. I had the stick full. It was a right crosswind. I had the stick full to the right, wishing I had more, and then a crabbed approach until I get this quarter mile. Then I had to kick the crab out, and then accept a slight drift as the airplane touched down, which I didn't like that at all. But there wasn't any choice. The drag chute buckle was attached to a point above our tank 4, our fuel tank 4, and that was essentially the center of gravity of the airplane when it's light. So the reason for that is that when we touched down, we immediately deployed the drag chute as soon as we felt the main wheels touch. The drag chute handle is up here on the left. You pull it out, and the flight manual said, When you pull the drag chute out, the drag chute handle, do not keep your hand near the drag chute handle. Why? Because in about 2 seconds, you're going to feel a quarter to G deceleration, and that would push your hand in there. And the way that you jettison the chute is to push the handle in. So that it's always amused when I see things like that because I know, there's a story behind it. So put the drag chute handle out while the airplane is still 15 degrees high. That's about what the 12 to 15 degrees. And it's a good feeling when your job is to stop the airplane to feel that quarter of a G deceleration immediately. So boom, jump. But there was no pitch tendency. It didn't tend to pitch down or pitch up as a result of where the buckle was located. So kind of watch your airspeed and gently make the landing for the nose wheel. If you did nothing, then the nose wheel would slam down on the runway and might break something. So landing the SR-71 was a 2-step, 3-step if you count the drag chute. Main wheel touchdown, drag chute out, and then gently land or lower the nose wheel to the runway. Once you're on the runway, engage nose wheel steering and test the brakes because you don't have reverse thrust, you don't have speed brakes, no flaps, no high lift or drag devices of any kind. And so your salvation is the brakes, which was the brakes and the landing gear were probably the weakest system in the SR-71. I had a test pilot ask me, "Well, you've flown this for a while. What's the weakest system?" And I couldn't think of it. Well, I guess it was the tires. The tires were only good for about 12 landings because they were like 460 psi of nitrogen. They were very hard. To have a 140,000-pound airplane like the SR-71 is fully loaded, you would like nice big balloon tires, but there wasn't enough room in the wheel well for balloon tires, so they had a tire that was literally this big around. They had 3 on each truck, and it went into its own little compartment. We called it a can. That was insulated and cooled by the air, so you don't want your tires heated up to 650 degrees. So it kept the tires so cool, and they were impregnated with aluminum for some reason. So they were silver tires, very pretty tires. But having such a high tire pressure, it tended to not. If it hit a rock, for instance, it wouldn't give. It would cut the tire. So we were very careful about checking the runway prior to takeoff and prior to landing. That was the mobile officer's duty to do that.
So going back to the landing phase, then you've got the chines outside the cockpit, sort of looking either side. You've got a 12 degrees nose up attitude. Are you able to see the runway
Yes.
in the final stages?
In the front seat of the A model, yes. The back seat of the B model, no, you couldn't see the runway. But you could see where the runway isn't, and that's where you want to fly. Now, in the turn to final, you're making a turn to final, then you can see the runway out there. But as you roll out, now the runway, you don't see the runway. But if you want to, sneak a peek, you could always hit the aileron a little bit and look. But you don't really have to. Just come on down because make a mental image of what's around the runway. Usually there's a stanchion, a light, something like that, and then just see where that is. And there's landing the airplane from the backseat of the B model was not. I'm not going to say it wasn't difficult. It was doable, quite doable, and I never felt bad about that. In fact, if I was an instructor pilot, I always demanded at least one landing for myself so I could maintain my proficiency.
How long was the airplane hot for once you'd landed? I read that you'd need to wait for a while before you could really touch the airplane.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff written. This is not true. The skin of the airplane is fairly thin, so when you come down, subsonic, now you're in minus 50 degree Fahrenheit. temperature. So the skin of the airplane cools. So there's nothing bad about the skin of the airplane. The thing that stays hot are the landing gear struts. Landing gear struts, take it from one who has been there, um, remains very hot for probably an hour, maybe 30 minutes to an hour after you land. I've heard that was the largest single piece of forged titanium, at least up to that point, that's been made. And it was a big, thick thing because it had to carry a lot of weight, and the airplane it wasn't recommended that you land heavy weight, full fuel, but you could do it. It was physically possible. And it was physically possible because of the strut. The landing gear strut was so big. So one time I was around the airplane, and after landing, and I was mobile, and I wanted to look at something. I came over to the and just touched the landing gear strut, and found out that yes, it stays hot. The brakes are hot too. The brakes are kind of small. It had six layers of brakes, and they would put at least one, maybe two gasoline-powered fans on the tires, both sets after landing, and keep them on there for about 20 minutes, just to make sure that, because the brakes have a tendency to increase in heat. I'm not sure how that works physically, but they say that the brakes get hotter after they sit. So they say the brakes were probably the weakest system on the Earth.
I wonder if it's a bit like cooking a chicken. You take a chicken out of the oven and it increases in temperature.
Could be. Cluck, cluck.
We need to find somebody who knows about thermodynamics. I think that'll have to be the next guest. We'll find out why chickens and tires and brakes heat up even once the heat's gone away from them.
But they were hot, and if you aborted a takeoff, for instance, then you had to, and there was maybe something that didn't matter much, and you wanted to take off again, you had to make sure that those brakes are cool, just in case you had to abort a second time.
And then the sensors, the cameras, whatever it is that you had gone out and used to get the intelligence that you were after. Was that immediately taken away from the airplane, and the wet film developed? Did you get to see it? What was the process from your point of view after the mission?
From an operational mission, we generally, and I say generally because one of my flights determined that it was unsafe to taxi into the hangar while the hangar was still wet. So when we would take off on an operational mission, first thing that maintenance would do would be to dry the floor of the hangar. If the floor of the hangar were not dry, then we couldn't taxi into it. I found that data point on one of my flights. I could tell you about it, but it's kind of long.
Well, is it interesting?
Well, it was for me.
Well, and I think you should share it. Well, the listeners can make their mind up.
Okay, there was. This was early on in my flying career, and I told you about the first year of flying, and I was having problems refueling. I never failed to get my fuel, but it just wasn't comfortable, and I found myself going like this. And I told you Rich Graham told me the exact technique to use to light the burner on the boom, and so after that, it was okay, but this was before Rich Graham told me this. So it was early in my career. I at Okinawa is where we fly. Most of our flights were for North Korea, and every once in a while we would fly what they call a rocket ride. And this was a ride where they wanted us to sneak up on them, so that they not be warned that the SR-71 was flying. And we would do a radio out procedure. We would have a pilot up in the tower to brief them on what was going on. And when time came for us to taxi, for instance, we just get a green light flash from the tower. We'd go out and taxi. Again, a green light from the tower, and we're ready for takeoff. And then we would take off, all radio silent, would not refuel. So we would have, instead of a 45,000 fuel load, we'd have a 65,000 fuel load. So we would go from brake release right up to Mach 3, which incidentally takes about 12 minutes. And people ask me, what is the acceleration like? Well, if you do the physics of from 0 to 2,000 miles an hour in 12 minutes, whatever acceleration that is. I never have worked it out, but it felt good. It was a nice pressure on my back, which I knew I was accelerating. Anyway, then we go to Korea and make one pass and then come back to Okinawa. Total time about 45 minutes or so. So I was scheduled for one of these rocket rides, and I thought, well, gosh, this is going to be really easy because I don't have to refuel. I'm just going to get in the airplane. I'm going to fly the airplane and have time to enjoy it. Well, when we took off, everything was fine. Going up in the accel, I started getting unstarts. And I'm not sure whether I did the procedure correctly because I was a little excited and I went through the procedure. I could not get the inlet not to unstart. It would unstart every time I go back to auto. I would try to fly manual. It would unstart. So I said, well, we can't make this mission. So we had to abort the mission. And then coming back to Okinawa, I had a generator trip off. Reset, and it was okay. Now, in the SR-71, if you lose both generators, the airplane crashes because the fuel boost pumps are AC operated. You can't operate them off the battery. And if you don't have the AC fuel pumps operating, there's not enough fuel pressure for the engines to operate. That was flight tested too. That was the first time the B model crashed was due to lack of generators. They had two B models, and then we after that happened before I came into the program, but then we only had one B model, and the wing issued a directive and had a bunch of emergencies where we had to land. We had to land as soon as possible, land as soon as practical, continue the mission, but don't do another loop. We had these type of criteria. And loss of one generator is a land as soon as possible. So it reset. So I came back, made approach, touched down, and as soon as I put the nose wheel down, there was a nose wheel shimmy that caused it. I swear it was plus or minus 20, 25 degrees of bank in the cockpit. So the cockpit was going bum, 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 bum. Lost the same generator, reset it. It was okay. I came back so quickly, 25 minutes or so, that they didn't have time to clean the floor, to sweep to the floor, or to remove the barrier at the end of the runway. The barrier for us was a barrier that would pop up and engage the main gear. The barrier for all the fighters that they had at Kadena was a cable across the runway that was raised by little donuts. So the cable in a donut. So the cable is about this far above the runway, which would engage a hook. But we didn't have a hook. We just had the main gear. So we had our own special barrier. Well, they didn't have time to remove the barrier. So I taxied over the barrier, blew a tire, just one as it turns out, because of the 460 PSI of the tires. I radioed. I said, "Do you want me to taxi in? Or do you want to tow?" Because I heard the thing blow, and they confirmed it was on. Oh no, go ahead and taxi in. All right. So going in the hangar, and I turn and just as normal going into the hangar, and when we're going as slow as I could go. When it came time to stop, I stepped on the brakes and nothing happened. I just kept on skidding because the oil content of the fuel was very slippery, and so the tires, even though the tires had stopped rolling, they just slid right on through. So here I am going towards a blast fence. They had both doors of the hangar open, so it was an open thing. But normally they had parked the Physiological Support Division van in front. Thank God it wasn't there. So I had room so I'm thinking to myself, I went to alternate steering brake and that didn't work. And I couldn't shut down the engine because then I lose nose wheel steering and brakes. then I'm really on my own. So I had to keep the engine going. I didn't know if I'd shut down the engine, whether it would stop or not, and it probably wouldn't. So I kept the engine. This thing had to make these decisions, within 2 seconds. So I said, I'll keep the engines running and hope that I can get to dry ground on the other side. But there wasn't enough room for the airplane and the blast fence to occupy the same area. So as soon as I came through the hangar, I kind of said one potato, two potato, three potato, because I did the wing out there. If I turn right then, the wing's going to hit the wall. So I waited till the last minute that I could to miss the blast fence and did a right turn about 30 degrees to the right. And as soon as the main wheel hit the dry pavement, I stopped. So what I thought was going to be a piece of cake, a fun mission, turned out to be probably, if someone asked me what my most significant flight in the SR-71 was, it was that. And to this day, I don't know what I would have done if I'd had that choice. If I was going to hit that blast fence, the material in front of the cockpit's rather soft. It's not stainless steel. It's a radar stuff. So am I going to have this radar in my lap, which would not be too good, or my other alternative would be to eject. I don't think I would have ejected. So anyway, it worked out.
If you had ejected, would your RSO have gone at the same time? Was it their command ejection system?
No, it's independent. He would have to do his own. So, and we didn't have enough time to even talk about that. It was just, he says, "What's going on? I can't stop. Alternate steering brake." And I said that, and that changes the power of the brakes from one system to the other. That wasn't the problem. Anyway, after that, they made a hard and fast rule that it was up to maintenance to make sure that the hangar floor was dry. On an operational mission, while we were shutting down the engines, they were taking the stuff off the airplane. It looked kind of like a pit stop at Indianapolis 500. And these guys come in, swarm in, and they have drills and taking off panels and everything, and then downloading the stuff, and then they're off. They're gone. Yes, we could see the materials. We were encouraged to see the materials, to see if there was anything that we could do. And I told you the story about the technician that said, "Sir, I think, sir, your pictures are fuzzy. Can't have that."
Your reference to the hangar floor being wet, for anybody who's sort of not sure about that, you're not talking about rainwater, are you? You're talking about wet because fuel leaked out of the aeroplane.
Absolutely, fuel. The worst I saw was like 1,000 pounds an hour of fuel. Just streaming fuel sometimes.
It is interesting to note that there's an SR-71 at Duxford here in Cambridgeshire in the UK, and they still have drip pans underneath that. I'm not sure if that's oil from the engine or hydraulics or something else, or maybe it's fuel. I don't know, but
maybe it's just to make the display look like the airplane really was in the hangar because it had drip pans.
So go take us back then to about 15 minutes ago, where you talked about sort of getting the mission down from the intelligence, the Vault, the intelligence people. We're making the assumption that people know what the SR-71's mission was, but can you give us a sort of an idiot's guide to what it did? What was the purpose of the airplane? And is it correct that these missions often came from the president or from somebody very senior in the military?
Well, yes, I'm sure it came from the president. The trolling mission definitely came from the president. To answer the broadest answer to that question is I don't know, because I never was in the staff that did that. There were a lot of crew members who went from being a crew member in the SR to the Pentagon, where they worked that kind of problem. The only thing I knew was that we were given our mission and told what was going to be on the airplane and when and where to operate it. That's all that I really knew about it. I'd heard lots of other things, but that's really all we knew. Now we could carry photo, two types of cameras. One was a horizon camera, and the other was one that would take, well, you could go into a bank and take a wide swath. But, then we had radar, and then we had listening devices, I call them, radios, things that sucked in electromagnetic information. The details of those things, of course, are classified, and I never studied them. I didn't know any of the details of any of that stuff. I knew about what the resolution of the cameras looked like because I could see the photos, but I never asked those questions. I never wanted to know what they were because we're in a business where the likelihood of our being captured was small, but it was there because we flew over and around countries that didn't want us there and would have delighted in capturing us or shooting us down. So, for that in mind, when I flew personally, I think most of us were there. As I told you before, we were military men on a military mission, flying a military airplane that was clearly marked, although you couldn't see it 15 miles in the air. But on my left shoulder was an American flag that had my name and it had my rank. So that identified me as a major lieutenant colonel. And then the only thing I carried with me was my military ID, which also was the Geneva Convention identification. And that's all I carried, but that identified me as who I was. So that was supposed to give us some sort of standing if we were captured. But if we were captured, they would want to know all the details of where we flew and what we did and when we took pictures and all that. And I couldn't tell them because I didn't know.
So who did the mission planning then? You would.
We did the mission planning. I knew where we were flying, and I knew when the sensors were going to come on. But what the sensors were looking for, what they did not interest me. I mean, it was interesting, but I didn't need to know that. The backseater knew the inner workings of the stuff. So he was the guy who handled any of the technical data that we as a crew needed to know.
So you can talk freely, I understand, from our first conversation about where you went and the missions you flew. You just mentioned that you sometimes overflew or you flew near to. Can you give us a taster then of a mission that stands out in your mind? You talked about Korea, about
yes.
North Korea being one.
In fact, I last time you asked me that, so I wrote some notes on that. So I'll just refer to the notes to make sure that the dates are correct. We call it the North Korea trolling mission. This was which took place on October 26, 1981. It started on November 13th, 1980, when I had the pleasure of flying a mission against North Korea. It was, I consider it just I hate to say routine because I hate the thing. He was on a routine mission. Well, none of our missions were routine, but we were on a normal reconnaissance mission over North Korea. And we get this message from the North Koreans. I know it's November 13th because that's my birthday. So I flew this thing on my birthday. And this is what North Korea said about it. Pyongyang, November 14th is when they sent the message out. The U.S. imperialist aggression forces, which are now hastening preparations for a war, frantically kicking up war dust against the northern half of the Republic of North Korea, i.e. North Korea, committed a military provocation by infiltrating an SR-71 high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance plane. At least they called us a reconnaissance plane. At around, gave a time, deep into the air above the coastal sea of our country east of Kaohsiung, east coast, for espionage, while raising a hue and cry over fictitious threat from the north these days. The U.S. imperialists perpetrate military provocations more frequently against our people zealously encouraging the military fascist gangsters. I guess that's the South Koreans. To anti-communist smear campaigns. Well, an anti-communist smear campaign wouldn't be hard, would it? After September 4th alone, the United States has infiltrated spy planes, we're spy plane, on 36 occasions into the air above the territorial waters and coastal sea of our country. It is a challenge to peace in Korea and her peaceful reunification. Uh-huh, and dangerous act jeopardizing peace in Asia and the rest of the world, that the U.S. imperialists continue penetrating espionage acts against our people at a time when our new momentous proposal to guarantee peace in Korea and achieve her peaceful reunification has evoked unanimous support and sympathy of the entire world and the North and South and the world and blah, blah, blah. So we got this, and this we just howled over this. When I was in Okinawa, we got this message, and it was a cause for a round of cheer, a pint, if you will. So that was really funny. So that happened on November 13, 1980. President Reagan had just been elected. Now, let me back up and say one little snippet. I joined the SR-71 group. I hadn't been a pilot, but I was checking out when President Ford was president. At that time, we overflew Cuba quite regularly. When President Carter was elected and came in 1977, then we might have flown one overflight, and then about 2 weeks later, the word was sent down that we would no longer overfly Cuba. Instead, we would fly around Cuba. So we would hit the southeast side of Cuba and then make a circle around the thing and then go away. We had our minders at the Pentagon ask, well, what are the rules of engagement? If we have a problem, like a loss of a generator or something, south of Cuba, can we overfly Cuba at Mach 3 to go to Florida? Because that's the way that we land as soon as possible. If you're going to land as soon as possible, you're going to do that. Well, the answer came down, no, you can't do that. You have to go all the way around. So, and we didn't like the idea of we're out there flying these missions and putting ourselves needlessly in danger of crashing because we might lose another generator, and going all the way around Cuba, especially subsonic, they could launch MiGs after or something like that. It just wasn't a good idea. But anyway, that's what we lived with. So then, sometime in the President Carter administration, there was a scare, if you will, of a Russian deployment of troops. I don't really know all the details, but for a while there, and then we overflew Cuba, maybe for a week or so. After that blew over, then we went back to you can't do it. So Reagan is elected. About 2 or 3 weeks after President Reagan was elected, we start overflying Cuba again. I mean, we do it quite often. And so that was one of my favorite missions, is to go over Cuba, just to boom Fidel Castro, who I hated. Just 90 miles from our, communist country, 90 miles from our country is unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, that was by way of introduction about President Reagan. So I think that the North Koreans were kind of testing him. Well, then on August 25th, 1981, Maury Rosenberg and Edie McKim were flying a reconnaissance mission over the demilitarized zone and over some land mass that the North Koreans claimed was theirs. Well, they shot a SA-2 at him, a surface-to-air missile. And Maury saw it out, and he was out of his right window, and it's kind of hard to tell where an explosion is because there's nothing to compare it to. So he says, just a few miles over there to the right. So in accordance with our rules of engagement, they made a turn directly to Okinawa. I think that they were through with their mission, but essentially they aborted the mission at that point. Came back and reported all that, and I was in England when that happened, and I was briefed on that, and we were kind of not concerned for our safety, but concerned that this might be a turning point in the relationship somehow. So from that point, our reconnaissance flights were drawn down about 30 miles south of where we normally flew. It's not that we flew the same line every time, but whatever line we were going to fly was about 30 miles south. So we would be well within, well outside of their area and well outside of their SA-2 threat range. So anyway, I arrived then. I was in England, and I came to Okinawa on September 24th, 1981. We were still drawing down then. Then on September 26th, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Frank Carlucci, came to our detachment. I didn't know much about him then, but he subsequently became the Secretary of Defense. But he was the deputy then. I was designated his briefing officer because I had been on the island like 2 days. We had a 3-day rule. You couldn't fly for 3 days, so I had nothing to do. And so the commander said, well, we have this guy, and I want you to take him out to the airplane and show him the airplane. He was a very nice man, and I was impressed that I was talking to the Assistant Secretary of Defense. I took him to the hangar to show him the SR-71. He asked very intelligent questions. I answered them. He asked mainly about our missions and how we looked at them and how we felt about them. And what I told him was, I said, well, we also flew training missions out of Okinawa, which really kind of not galled us, but why are we doing this? Why don't we fly an operational mission? So I made that suggestion. I said, we're flying training missions out of here. Why don't we just go up to Korea or the Kamchatka Peninsula or something and maybe do some good? And anyway, we I don't know if that worked, but we didn't fly too many training missions after that. He was a very personal man. I put him in the cockpit, and he was not a pilot, so he didn't really know what to ask, but I showed him the special switches for the inlet and everything. He also mentioned that President Reagan was furious when he heard that they shot at us. Then that was on September 26th. Then on October 3rd, the Air Force Vice Chief of Staff, Robert Mathis, came to our detachment and briefed us on a special mission that was going to be flown. Now, Maury and Edie's mission was a 2-loop mission. The first loop was flying between Taiwan and China. The second loop was flying twice over the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. It was on their last pass that they were fired on. So the General Mathis said that we would fly a mission exactly like the one that Maury and Edie flew. Exactly. So it would be a 2-loop mission and go through straight to Taiwan and so forth. And that they wanted us over a particular designated area, which was where they fired the missile, within 1 minute. And he said, we'd really like plus or minus 30 seconds, but we'll give you a minute. And so one of us asked, well, why do you want us to do that? And I said, well, because we plan to smash their launch facility. So the fighters that are going to do the mission are going to be headed in the right direction at that time. So if they fire at you, what he wanted was the missile to come off the rails and then the missiles to hit the site virtually simultaneously. So I got to fly that mission. When we flew missions, there was not people designated. It was just whose turn it was. All of us, all of our crew members were very jealous. Is that a too? We were very cognizant of who flew last and who was next and so forth. We called it the crew ladder. The crew ladder was sacred. So we didn't want to break the crew ladder. So it's not that I was picked to do this. I was just the next guy up. But I was happy I was going to fly. So I flew that mission on October 26th. And we had some timing triangles. We took off early, and we had some timing triangles so that if we took off not early, that we would have some time to make up. So we did take off early. We did the first part of the mission, and then we utilized the timing triangles to kill some time. But we went over the site right on time, and then there was no missile launch. And I have to admit that I hate to say this, but I was slightly disappointed that they didn't, because I thought that would have definitely demonstrated the resolve of the United States government against North Korea, because it was a communist country and I hated them. So there you go. Now we got a message from the North Koreans over this mission that I flew. So they must have known something was going on. This is dated October 27th. This is the day after. The U.S. imperialist aggressors infiltrated an SR-71 high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance plane deep into the sky above the territorial waters of our country, the east of Hong on the eastern coast from so forth time, and again sent the plane into the sky above the peninsula on the west coast. Well, that's true. So they had us. October 26 to commit espionage acts in succession against the northern half of the DPRK. They say the northern half because they claim South Korea is theirs too. So the northern half of the Democratic Republic. Lately, U.S. imperialist aggressors are ever more viciously committing espionage acts against our country, frequently changing the time of infiltration. Yeah, that's true. Of the spy plane. Oops, that's word. And the course of its flight. Espionage acts committed by the spy planes of the U.S. imperialist aggressors in the airspace of our country after November 11th, after October but we're number 11 after October the 2nd. This shows that the U.S. imperialists' new war preparations, read President Reagan, have entered a very grave state. They must be clearly mindful that there is a limit to the patience of our people and stop at once their espionage and hostile acts against the northern half of their country. We didn't stop. That was funny. We enjoyed that. I don't know if the North Koreans had any idea how much we enjoyed getting those messages.
Well, they know now. So, BC, talk about being intercepted and being shot at then. Did it happen to you, moving that reconnaissance track 30 miles south suggests that you were concerned that you could be hit. Was there a credible threat against you?
Well, I don't think there was. Now, the SA-5 came into existence while I was flying the SR, and we were briefed that the SA-5 was a new missile that had the capability of doing that. But we did fly through SA-5 rings around Murmansk. That's where they had them. And, they never fired at me that I know of. They monitored us. We had the lights for a monitor launch and we had three lights. I forgot what they were called, but one was a monitor light. But we knew that they were looking at us. You asked about the periscope. The periscope had three functions. One was to find out if we were laying down a contrail. And quite often, quite often, we would have a contrail up around Murmansk. It was very cold up there at altitude, and we would be laying down a contrail. So they could see us, not only ping us on radar, but see us. But that was not a reason to abort the mission or anything. The other two reasons was to check the trim of the rudders, because you could tell if the rudders were streamlined. They had a little notch there that you could check. The other thing is at night, you could trim your engines by looking at the color of the afterburner, which incidentally was beautiful.
Really?
There, you look through the periscope, you see both of the afterburners. They were blue and white. And we had the power to change the EGT RPM relationship of the engines. And so we could actually trim the engines or do it with the throttle. And so if you had the rudders centered and your fuel flow the same and the afterburners looked the same, then you know you're pretty well in trim.
What about fighters? There are stories of sort of Russian fighters coming up trying to intercept and flaming out because they just didn't have the performance. Do you see any of that?
Yes, it's in the Baltic Sea. We were sometimes briefed to watch out for them because they had intelligence that they were going to do something, I guess. But again, it never bothered us. I have seen contrails. I never saw an airplane that I could identify. Of course, I wasn't just looking out the window. We rarely looked out the window, especially on a what they call a take mission, an operational mission. We were in the denied/take area. My focus was here, down in the cockpit. So I wasn't really looking for them, but occasionally I would look out the window and see contrails. Nothing that I know about.
You mentioned in the previous interview that you would you'd sort of go up to 12 and a half miles from the border, which is 12 miles is the international border. But it sounds like you also overflew Russia. Is that the case?
We did not fly the Soviet Union, nor China.
Okay. Why not? What was different between China and North Korea?
Well, we had a treaty after Francis Gary Powers was shot down. That was part of the get him back. Which is, the United States did not like to have reconnaissance pilots or RSOs captured because in Britain, I'm sure it's the same way. The government is humanitarian in that respect, and so they did a lot of concessions to get Francis Gary Powers back that really they didn't want to do, but they did it. So we said we will not overfly you, and we didn't. Now, if somebody did, and I don't think anyone ever did because I never heard about it, it would have been a mistake. That's why I said when I see the landmass go underneath the chine, I'm a little bit nervous because I sure don't want to be the first guy to do that. Our missions were all monitored by unknown persons. How they did it, I'm not sure, but usually sometimes we would have ECRC 135s out away from this thing. There were other ways that they were monitoring, maybe satellites, I don't know. But if we got off course, I think that someone would know about it. Certainly we would know about it. We also, in our airplane, we had what's called a mission recording system, MRS system. And it, I forgot how many parameters it measured and recorded, but it was virtually everything the airplane did. Switches, switch position, and all that. Certainly position, altitude, speed, Mach, all that.
You've talked about Okinawa. You've talked about the UK. So there were two detachments.
Well, when I came in, there were only one. That was Okinawa. That was Det 1. And then the U2s were with us at Beale also. So they had, I guess they had Det 2 and 3. I'm not sure. But anyway, then Det 4 was RAF Mildenhall. And that came in about 1981 or 2. Before that, we were flying the Murmansk missions out of Beale, out of California. So you go from California all the way to the Soviet Union, Murmansk, and back, a 10.5-hour mission. And that was really tough. I flew one of those, and there's a story that I wrote about having to divert into Norway. So I had the distinction of being the first SR-71 to land in continental Europe. We landed in England, but not in continental Europe. That's an interesting story, and it's online. If you just Google BC Thomas Norway, and you'll get that story.
It caused a lot of, naturally, there was a lot of interest in that event.
Yeah, it was the first one, and so it did. It caused a lot of interest in Norway as well as in our chain of command. Because the airplane, I mean, I had top secret stuff on board. I'm landing unannounced at a base that we never landed at. We didn't have any. I don't think we had any agreements written between us and the Norwegians about how to care for the airplane. So we were pretty much on our own. Now Norway is a NATO ally, so I certainly expected to be treated nicely. I expected it, but I wasn't sure. But we were treated very nicely. It was really a pleasant experience. They told me they they had a first lieutenant F-104 fighter pilot named Roar Strand, who's a great guy. I saw him just about a year ago or so. He came to San Francisco and we had dinner together. Anyway, he was my my minder. he uh, he the General Omar at Norway said that he would be there to help us and to take care of anything that we might need. But I think he was also there to make sure we didn't do anything stupid. And so he took us to a restaurant. He took us to his apartment, and this is after we took care of the airplane. It was a pleasant experience. It wasn't pleasant, to call back to the commander and tell him I'm in Norway, the wing commander.
How did you take care of the airplane? If it's got this secret stuff on it, who was looking after it?
Well, armed guards were, as it turns out. I asked the general. We had a set of instructions. If you have to land away, this is the things you have to do. And one of them was to secure the airplane, obviously. And so we had a oil leak problem. So when I landed there, I didn't want to keep the engine running too long, but I wanted to keep both engines running in case I had to move the airplane. So I was talking to first, it's a civilian military field. I was talking to the civilian controllers. Then I was turned over to the military. But you can't taxi the SR-71 on one engine very well because there's so much torque involved. So I wanted to keep both engines running, in idle, of course. So then we went to a spot, and I said, do you have chocks? Yes. And so I said, please make sure that they're chocked nicely, because when you shut down the engines, there are no brakes. And if you're on a hill or something, what a horrible thing that would be. So I had all the shirts. So then I shut down the engines and opened the canopy, and they brought, I think it was a pickup truck or something with a ladder. And first thing was a major, a Norwegian Air Force major, popped up and said, well, welcome to Norway. He says, well, thank you very much. And then he says, do you know Bill Groninger? Well, Bill was one of our pilots. Well, of course I know Bill. Well, he was my instructor when I went through training. So most of the guys there, the F-104 pilots, had gone through training in the United States. I say most of them, at least some of them did. He did. And so it was, he spoke great English. And so from there, it was fine. The commander met me, and he was a very nice man, and very proper. And so he took me to his underground, or carved into a mountainside. I'd heard about these things, but I'd never seen one, where he had hangars, airplanes, maintenance, shops, everything is in this mountain. Well, it's pretty doggone impressive. So I asked for a secure phone, and he had that. And I called back to my command post and told them everything. They already knew that I'd landed, but they didn't know all the details. So I told them the details, and before that, I asked the commander if he would station armed guards on the airplane, if he would do that. And he says, "Oh, yes, we'll do that." So he did that, and there wasn't any problem. We were there 3 days. It took one whole day to get the cadre of people there. But they'd done this before. From landing away, like I had landed Holloman, I think was the first place I landed, Mountain Home and other places, not U.S. bases, but the drill was really the same. They bring all the equipment because no base has the equipment for the SR-71. The tow bars don't work or anything. So they have to bring everything from Veal, and so they know how to do it. And brought a tanker in for my fuel, and so it worked out well. That story is online, and it's kind of lengthy, so, but I think it's interesting.
Can you talk a little bit about the culture then? So you've already described, about sort of being inducted into the program, and despite having a test pilot background, being sort of put in your place and told you would fly, when the time was right. And you've talked about, I think, some elements of the culture, but what was it like being in that community?
It was great. I mean, that's a short answer. It was good. I liked it. It was exactly not exactly what I thought it was going to be, but it was my best thoughts of how that would be. We were close knit, really were. I never had any personal problems with any of them, with any of my fellow crew members. We were all very much gung ho on the mission. We really, that was the first thing. Is the mission came first above everything else. And we had fun. We had fun. We were serious, but we had fun. And the thing about giving each other simulators is really remarkable. And I think the astronauts do the same thing. But we were not easy on each other. When I was an old time guy going in the simulator, and the guy that I checked out as my instructor, he didn't pull punches, and the debrief was the same way. Did you notice that? So, well, maybe I didn't notice it. Something that he had done. We could pull any circuit breaker as an instructor, as a simulator instructor, and then in addition to that, we had failures, little failure modules that we could fail. If they gave you an unstart, now the one thing about the circuit breaker is if there was no way to mask the pop of the circuit breaker. So what we would do is give the guy an unstart, and during the unstart, pull the circuit breaker. that was a little known fact that I learned later. Whatever the circuit breaker was,
What sort of traditions did you have? There was.
Well, I can say one thing about this simulator that my goal to myself was I would never want to crash. I don't want to crash an airplane, but I want to crash a simulator during the simulator sessions. Well, I got over that one real quick. This is something that stuck with me. It's this was like sortie 3 or 4. It's pretty early in the program, but just on the takeoff. Usually the takeoff is routine, but because the real interesting stuff is when you get airborne. So on takeoff, I'm going down there, and there's no visual reference at all. So I'm making a 30-degree bank turn out of traffic from the takeoff, and the gear is up, and everything's fine. Well, he failed my attitude indicator at 30 degrees, and but let the standby indicator, which is right above it, but it's smaller. And I didn't notice it. I didn't cross-check. And guess what happened? Well, by the time I realized what was going on, I was, 20 degrees nose low or something like that. Because my attitude indicator was frozen, and I couldn't pull out. I crashed. And when you crash the simulator, this is what happens: a bell rings, a horn sounds, the simulator is in a thing nose low, and a red light goes beep beep beep. Now, why is that? Because you don't ever want to do that again. So every time I took off, Jay Reed was really apologetic. He didn't notice it either, and he's got the same attitude indicator back there, the standby. So from then on, every takeoff, as I told you, Jay was very, very meticulous about reading the checklist and everything. He would always tell me that attitudes checked, attitudes checked, attitudes checked. Thanks, Jay. Thanks. So anyway, I only crashed once, and I never forgot that. Taking off in the weather, man, I'm checking that standby attitude. And let that be a lesson to you too, if you're flying airplanes. I can tell you a funny story about happening in pilot training.
Go on, why not?
Okay, my first solo in the jet was a T-37, and I was so proud of myself that day. I mean, you bought my instructor a bottle of booze like we're supposed to, and so he says, "Today, Lieutenant Thomas, you can go fly the airplane by yourself." Wow! So I get in this T-37. First thing is go out to the area and do some things, and then come back and shoot some patterns. You had to get 2 touch and goes and a full stop. So I did that, and I came back, and my first 2 touch and goes I thought were just marvelous. And I was just so proud of myself. So I'm going around to make my final landing. So I'm on base. I turn downwind. There's a runway back there. It's time to turn final. Turning final, gear check, full stop. And I had to say student pilot or something like that. Call sign, yeah, student pilot. And so then about 1, 2, 3, 5 seconds later, I hear this call. Airplane turning final, gave me a call sign. No gear, go around. Forgot to put the gear down. I was so damn mad at myself that I didn't acknowledge the radio call. I put the thing up. Gosh, if I remember it's hard. And so then, since I didn't answer them, that's mistake number 2. They start shooting flares at me. And my instructor is in the mobile unit watching all this. Well, you can imagine the debrief I had on that. Well, so that's the only ride that I flunked in the pilot training, but I had to do a progress check after that, which was another solo ride. Okay. No, it was with the instructor and making sure the gear down. And I swear, every time I put the gear down in an airplane after that, I thought about it. It's right here.
Yeah.
Turning base, gear check, full stop. No. No gear. Oh my gosh.
Did you have any? What about culture? Can you talk about habu, tie cutting? Those are things in the SR community.
Yeah, the first operational flight, which is after Det 4, didn't have to be Okinawa, but traditionally it was Okinawa was the first operational flight. You're supposed to buy some goofy looking tie. Mine was a purple and orange tie or something like that. The best one was Bob Crowder, who had it looked like an American flag. It wasn't a flag because you don't cut flags. It had red, white, and blue. Rather pretty. Anyway, his was the best. I couldn't find something like that. When you come down, then you get your habu patch. Well, the habu patch is sewn on your on our flight suit as we were flying, assuming that they get the word that we went into the take area. Then that's an operational mission. And so then they have sewing people and put a habu patch